When we previously looked at the issue of recognition and reward, we argued that the key theme that's operative when you're recognizing and rewarding is the issue of fairness. It is not about motivation. When one looks at the issue of fairness from the point of view of empowerment, we indicated previously that empowering somebody means to give them the means to do what's required of them, to make them able to do what's required of them, and to hold them accountable. And in a sense, when you're holding somebody accountable, you're recognizing and rewarding them because their behavior has been above standard. But fundamentally, when you're holding somebody accountable, you've got to hold them accountable for what they're contributing rather than the results that they're getting. And this is because the results, in a sense, are in the hands of the other. One doesn't have any power over results. Fundamentally, what sits in the self's hands, what the self has power over, is what the self contributes or gives. So if you want to empower somebody, you've got to focus their attention on what they're giving, not just the results that they're getting. And your recognition and reward, therefore, has to bear their contribution in mind, rather than just the results. How this translates into an organizational setting is that any person in an organization does a set of tasks, which together produce a result required of that person. Fundamentally, when you're holding somebody accountable, you should be giving attention to the tasks that the person is doing, rather than the results. We did argue that the results aren't irrelevant because the results are the means to see whether the tasks are appropriate. However, it is clear that the tasks are in a sense what the person gives, it's what they actually do, it's their contribution, and the results is what they get. And what we're trying to argue is that an empowered organization gets people to give attention to what's in their power, in other words, what they're giving. Previously, when we looked at the issue of accountability, it became apparent that the column of tasks and the column of results can both either be positive or negative, which means from the point of view of how you should recognize and reward people, this produces a natural complexity of 4 permutations. We indicated, for example, the first permutation is if the person did everything that was required of them and they got a good result, the appropriate thing to do with that person is to recognize and reward them. We indicated further that if the person did all the things that was required of them, but they didn't get the result that's required of them, then it may still be appropriate to recognize and reward them, but you have to understand the disconnect. The disconnect could be for one of 2 reasons. In the first instance, it might be because of something that happened to the organization that was unforeseeable, in which case you would do exactly the same thing in the next reporting cycle. Or it might have been because the standard that was articulated at the beginning of the reporting cycle for the person's contribution was inappropriate. However one looks at this, it would not be appropriate to censure or punish the person. Further to that, we indicated that if the person's contribution wasn't required, further to this, we indicated that if the person's contribution was substandard and the result was not what was required, you would censure or punish them. And then finally, if the person's contribution was substandard and the result was in excess or was of what was required of them, this is a very complex scenario. You may reward the person because it might become apparent that what the person did was actually the equivalent of going the extra mile, because the standard that was articulated for them at the beginning of the reporting cycle was inappropriate. You might actually decide that what the person did was just luck, in which case you would do nothing at all, or you might even censure them. You might actually discover that the person did short-term things that would produce a short-term result but would actually damage the organization, in which case it would be appropriate to punish them. So what we therefore concluded is that you cannot recognize and reward people on the basis of results alone. You actually have to understand their contribution, and when you recognize and result people, you've got to focus on their contribution as the critical variable. So if we look at it from an organizational point of view, let's first look at how this would impact the worker. Clearly, the worker produces a set of results at the end of his shift or at the end of his working period, but in order to produce that set of results, he would do a set of things against a standard that would enable him to produce that result. Now, when his boss, the overseer, assesses his performance with the intention to either recognize and reward him. What he looks at fundamentally are the tasks that the person is doing. How well is the person doing the task against the standard that's being articulated? And that would allow him to decide whether he was going to recognize or reward the person. Similarly, when we look at the overseer also produces a result, but he does a whole set of things against a standard that enables him to produce the result. When the boss assesses the overseer's performance, what he's fundamentally looking at is whether the overseer is doing what's required of him against the standard that's been articulated. And that would then allow him to decide whether he is going to recognize or reward the person. And then finally, when Lord Creosote assesses the boss, what becomes apparent is that the boss produces a set of results, but he does a whole set of things in a reporting period that produces those results. When Lord Creosote assesses the boss's performance, what he actually needs to look at is how the boss is acting consistent with the standard for his job, and that would then give him the material for him to decide whether he would recognize or reward the boss.